lesson from our summer series tonight. Tonight our speaker will be our son-in-law, Wayne Scott. It's good to have Wayne and Kim with us fishing tonight. Of course, a lot of y'all already know Wayne and Kim. They were originally from Alabama, but they went to school at Freed Hardman, graduated from Freed Hardman, and they've been living in Henderson, Tennessee past several years. They're members of the Henderson Church of Christ, where Wayne serves as a deacon. Kim is a children's Bible class teacher. They spent many years in the field of education. And so without further words, if Wayne wants to tell you anything else, he can tell when he gets up here.
Thank you, Roger. On Friday, I celebrate 33 years as Roger being my father-in-law and Nana, Ruth, being my mother-in-law. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, and appreciate the good work that you do here, and know that a lot of good things happen here at the Valdosta Church, and we hear a lot about you, and appreciate the good work that you do. And if you got your Bibles with you tonight, I want you to go ahead and open them up. We're going to be looking, first of all, in Matthew chapter 5. We're talking about evangelism tonight, but I want to kind of take it at a different angle. A lot of times when we think about evangelism, what we think about is, studying with people and teaching them the truth. And that's an important part of it. But there's something that goes along with that a lot of times we forget about. And that is the fact that when we go to study with people and teach people, we need to be living what we're talking about. And so tonight I want us to look at how our example as Christians is important in evangelism, because that's one of the most important things that we can do is we can live the Christian life. Now, I've known a lot of people over the years who could sit down and tell you how to do things, and but for them sitting down and doing it themselves, a lot of times they didn't do it and they didn't live it out. And you probably heard people tell you before, I'd go to church there, but there's hypocrites there. And, they say things like that, and they try to reason with themselves and make themselves right by doing that. But, wherever we go, whatever we do, we're going to be around hypocrites. And as Christians, it's important for us to be the right kind of people. People watch us all the time. You may not realize that. You may not think about it very often, but wherever we go, there are people watching us. They see how we act, they see what we do, and they pay attention to that. Especially today in the generation we live in with cell phones and people taking selfies and people posting constantly on social media, things about their life, people are watching. They pay attention. I remember several years ago, Charles Barkley did a commercial for Nike. Now, we all love Charles Barkley because he grew up in Alabama, and he's funny. He's a little crude sometimes, but he's funny. But he said on a Nike commercial one time, he said, "I am not a role model." Now, here was a man who was on national TV, watched by millions of people every week when he was playing basketball, looked up to by countless young men around the world, and he said, "I'm not a role model." I'm going to tell you something. He was wrong. He was wrong because there were people watching him. And I'm going to tell you today, if you think that you're not a role model, you couldn't be any more wrong than Charles Barkley was, because we are role models to the world. The world looks at us and they pay attention to what we do. Now, I remember when my kids were growing up, they'd get mad at somebody and they'd want to get on their phones and they'd want to post something. And I'd tell them, not the way to handle it, not the way to handle it. You don't do that. You don't throw something out there on social media that's going to be there for years to come and that you'll regret saying. You need to hold your tongue. If you got something to say, you need to say it to the individual, because those types of things will come back and they will haunt you. And isn't that true today? My son was just telling me the other day, he said, I'm glad you told me that. He said, now that I'm getting into business, I see what you were saying, how important it is to watch what you say. But as Christians, everything that we do, we need to do to the glory of God. And we need to set the right kind of example to the world. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, Jesus there speaking on the Sermon on the Mount, And this passage is very familiar to us, but I want us to read it anyway. And I want us to pay attention to what Jesus said. Beginning in verse 13, he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste," I'm reading from the English Standard Version, "how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." You see, the first thing I want us to notice there is living godly and being a godly example is commanded by Jesus. He tells us right there that we're a salt. We are salt. And we know the preservation that comes from salt. We know that in the Old Testament, all the grain offerings were to be given with salt. And I think what Jesus is telling us there is that we all are important because we portray to the world what being a Christian is all about. You know, people want to look at different things in this world, and they want to be heard, and they want to be verified, they want to feel like they're important. I'm going to tell you something. Jesus right here tells us how important we are. His plan is for us to go out into the world and us to be an example to those that we come into contact with and us to influence them. Now, when I see that and when I read that, it amazes me to think that Jesus knows that people are watching us. And their opinion of the Lord's church is based on how they see us act. He says there that we're a city that's set on a hill. You know, when you got a city sitting up on a hill, you can't hide that city because of all the lights and all the things that are going on. We know that. He says we're like a candle that's lit at night or a lamp that's lit at night. You know, in the first century, they couldn't go in and turn on their light. And boom, you know, turn a light switch and then the light would be on. Sometimes in my office, I go in and turn it, doesn't come on. I have to turn it again and turn it till it comes on. But, you know, they didn't have that. And when that lamp was lit, it lit up that whole room. And it gave light, and you could see where you're going. And Jesus says, we are like that candle. We are a light in a dark world. And he says, let your light so shine so that others may see your good works and give glory to your Father which is in heaven. His plan is for us to set the right kind of example for the world, to show them what Christianity is all about, and to live the way that He wants us to live. Now that sounds simple. That sounds easy. But when you start doing it every day, you start living it out, that's when it gets a little bit tough, isn't it? And that's when sometimes we struggle with being the right kind of example. But Jesus wants us to do that. In John chapter 13, in verse 15, more words of Jesus. When Jesus there is speaking in John chapter 13, listen to what He says there in verse 15. You know, a very simple passage again, and I want us to just notice these are simple commandments from Jesus, simple requirements from Him. In verse 15, He says, "For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you." Now, the apostles didn't understand all that Jesus was saying. The disciples didn't understand everything that He was saying. He says, but let me tell you this, what I have done is I have given you an example. And He says, what I did, I want you to go out and I want you to do as well. I want you to live the same kind of way. Now, I'm going to ask you something. Would we be able to evangelize people if we acted like Jesus? Shake your head like this. We would, wouldn't we? Because people would know that we cared about them, that we were concerned about their soul, and that we wanted them to know God, and we would do what they needed to be done. We'd teach them, and we'd share His message with them. I want to ask you tonight, how do we treat others when we don't get our way? I've dealt with college students for 32 years, and I've seen over and over how college students react when they get mad. And now what I'm going to tell you is that a lot of times it's not the way that Jesus would have reacted. But then I'd start dealing with their parents, and I'd say, well, now I can see why they acted the way they did. My wife is an elementary school principal, and she was talking about a parent today that came to see her and was fussing because they didn't get their way. Because they didn't get their way, they showed out. They acted up, they acted ugly, and, she had to deal with it. And a lot of times that's what happens. We got to remember that we're Christians. And when we don't get our way, we don't act up, we don't show out, we don't throw a fit, we don't cry, we don't sit around and fuss. We treat them like Jesus would treat them. And we go on from there because we're different from the world. Do others see Jesus in the way that you treat them? Do others see Jesus in your life by the way that you treat them? Like I said, a lot of times we want to get our way and we don't care about others sometimes, but we've got to remember that people are watching us and we've got to set the right kind of example. Well, let me ask you another question. How do we treat each other? I know sometimes those that are closest to us are the ones who feel the wrath that we have. The ones that are closest to us are the ones that we will treat the worst many times. I saw that with my kids growing up, and I saw that with me growing up. My kids would say things to me they probably wouldn't say to anybody else, and I'd probably say things to my parents I wouldn't say to anybody else. And as brothers and sisters in Christ, a lot of times we'll say things to each other that we wouldn't say to anybody else. Our example is so important. We don't have near the compassion and forgiving spirit a lot of times with our brothers and sisters that we do with others. And that's a shame. You see, because love for each other is one of the things that Jesus says will distinguish us from the world. Look down at verse 35 of John chapter 13, a beautiful passage that you all are familiar with. Jesus said, "By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you're always right." Or if you think you're always right. Is that what he says? No. He says, this is how people will know you're my disciples if you have love one for another. If you have love for each other. I'm going to tell you some of the things that ways I've seen brothers and sisters treat each other sometimes. It's kind of scary. It's like we don't even like being together. We don't want to be around each other. And as Christians, that's what Jesus says sets us apart. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. And let's treat each other with love. And let's set the right kind of example. It doesn't matter if we're at a baseball game, at a basketball game, if we're at a church service, if we're in a grocery store, if we're at McDonald's in line and they mess up our change, mess up our order, we still treat people kindly. And we remember that we're setting a godly example for others. Now that's kind of hard sometimes to say, because some of the times that I've seen Christians act the worst has been at some sporting events. And sometimes at a Dixie Youth baseball game. When my son was playing baseball from age 6 to about 16 baseball, I helped coach, and so I heard a lot, saw a lot, and it was interesting to see how some of the people that were at church with me on Sunday morning would act on a Monday night at a baseball game. They'd say something, they'd do something, and I would say, wait a second. This is an 8-year-old baseball game. Do you know what we're talking about? There's nothing to lose your cool and composure over that. This is a 10-year-old baseball game or a basketball game. You don't need to lose your composure over that. Remember that the world is watching, and definitely treat your Christian brothers and sisters better than that. And I think sometimes I probably, when I was coaching, may have yelled too much at my son. That's one of the things that I always found myself doing, yelling at him and not everybody else, because I knew what he could do. And I expected more out of him. But I got to think about the kind of example that I set when I'm out there coaching, I'm out there yelling, I'm out there fussing. You need to remember that God has commanded us to set a good example for those who are around us. Every single one of us, He's commanded to set an example. The second thing I would say on our example as far as evangelism goes is we get to choose what kind of example that we set. We get to choose that. It's not something that just spontaneously happens. Something takes control of us and controls us and sets some kind of example. We get to choose what kind of example we set. Look over in Philippians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. That book of Philippians is such a pretty book, just a small book with those 4 chapters there. But in those 4 chapters, he says so much that's pertinent to us as Christians. In verse 17, Paul writes, and he says, brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. He says, wait a second. He says, what you need to do is you need to watch me. He says, I will be the right kind of example. And he says, not only that, he says, pay attention to those people around you who walk according to the example that you see in us or that you have in us. And he says, pay attention to those people around you who are living right, who are doing right, and pay attention to what they're doing, and you do the same things. In verse 18, he says, for many of whom I have often told you and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. You see, there were some who had been Christians who now were enemies of the cross. He said, I've told you how, there are some out there that are enemies of the cross, and they're going to take away any joy they can for Christians. And he says, you've got a choice here. You can walk with them, or you can walk like I do. And we have a choice what kind of example that we set. And that's why it's so important for us to determine in our minds and in our lives and in our hearts to do the right thing. Because we get to choose what kind of example we are. And isn't that a blessing? Isn't that a blessing that we get to choose? We have that free will. We choose ourselves what kind of lives we're going to live and who we're going to follow. And we have the opportunity to follow God. It's a blessing that we have the opportunity to choose that kind of example. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, when Paul wrote to Timothy, beginning in verse 11, I want us to read several verses there. Beginning in verse 11, when he writes, he says, command and teach these things. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech and conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. He's talking to the young Timothy here. He says, don't let them look down on you because you're young. He says, but here's what you do. You set the right kind of example. He says, set an example in speech, the things that you say, the way that you talk to others. There's a lot of things involved in the way that we talk. He says in your conduct, the way that you live, in your love, in your faith, and in your purity. These are the things you need to focus on. He goes on in verse 13 there. He says, until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, to teaching. Do not neglect the gift you have, which was given you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. Practice these things. Immerse yourself in them so that all may see your progress. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing, you will save both yourself and your hearers. Now, when Paul was writing to Timothy, he knew that he was going to set the right kind of example. And he says, all this stuff he says to him here, set these right kinds of examples. Live the right kind of life, because what's going to happen is you're going to save yourself and you're going to save your hearers. Now, if Timothy was a man who cheated people, who mistreated people, who was not a faithful Christian, they would have noticed that. And they would not have wanted any part of that. But he chose to be the right kind of example. And we get to choose what kind of example we are. And I want you to think about your life tonight. When people look at you and they watch you, they see the kind of person you are. Do they see the kind of person that he mentioned there in 1 Timothy chapter 4? Do they see somebody who's setting the right example in the way that they speak, in the way that they act, in the way that they love, in their faith, in their purity? Are we making a difference by the kind of lives that we live? You see, we're commanded to be a godly example, and we can choose what kind of example we are. But then thirdly, we need to be real. We need to be authentic. We need to be people who are dedicated to God. We're going to talk about the Scribes and the Pharisees in a minute. They appeared to be real or authentic, but when you look at their lives, what you see is somebody anything but. Turn your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. We'll begin in verse 10, and I'm going to read through verse 16. 1 Peter 2, verse 10 through 16. He says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. That verse right there, verse 13, is one that has, or verse 12, has jumped out at me for a long time. Peter, as he writes, he realizes that the world is going to point fingers and they're going to blame us and they're going to say things about Christianity. And you hear it today. We're bigoted. We're closed-minded. We don't see the world like it is. They say all kinds of things. But Peter says you need to live in such a way that when they say these evil things about you, that they'll see your good deeds and they'll glorify God who's in heaven. In other words, the things that they say won't stick, because that's not the kind of person we are. That's not the kind of people we are. That's not the kind of lives that we live, because we are real, we're authentic, we're able to, when we say we're a Christian, we're faithful. He goes on in verse 13 and he says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Boy, that says a lot right there, doesn't it? He says, by doing the will of God, by doing good, we can put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Now, if we're not living the godly life and we're talking about it, it's not going to do anything but hurt us. He says, but if you're living right, you're setting the right kind of example, and they talk about you, people are going to realize how foolish they are, that it's not true, that it's not right. He says in verse 16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover for evil, but living as servants of God. Living as servants of God. You see, we need to be real. We need to be authentic, and people need to see Jesus coming out in everything that we do. But what happens a lot of times is instead of Jesus coming out, they see us coming out. They see things coming out of us that they don't need to see. And it makes a difference when we set the wrong kind of example. And we need to be real. We need to be authentic. We need to be who we say that we are. In Titus chapter 2, in verses 6 through 8, Paul writes to Titus there, and as he writes to him, it's amazing, the same type of thought that he says to him there. And, he's going to encourage him to make sure that he's living right as well. But when we think about this, let's look carefully at what he says. Titus, to be self-controlled. I want you to notice in chapter 2 there, in those first 6 verses, 3 times he mentions being self-controlled. That was a problem that people had. That's a problem people have today. He says there in verse 6, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. You see, those things that he talks about there are things that jump out to us. When he says, in your teaching, show integrity, it means that we're honest, doesn't it? That means that we're real. He said, not only show integrity, he says, go on and show dignity and sound speech. And he says, this is the kind of example that you live. And this comes from a person who is real, a person who's authentic, who is a faithful Christian, not somebody who's just going through the motions, pretending to be a Christian. But this is from a Christian who is real. And the point is, when we're authentic, the world will notice. In Matthew chapter 23, there's a scathing rebuke there of the Scribes and the Pharisees. And when we look at the Scribes and the Pharisees, it's easy for us many times to point out their mistakes and the errors that they made, and they're abundant. But let me tell you something about the Scribes and the Pharisees. They knew the law. They knew it better than anybody else, didn't they? They knew the law. They dedicated themselves so much to the law, they lost the meaning of the law. They lost the point of the law. And they were just going through the motions. And in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus gives them 7 woes. And he calls them hypocrites. And he goes on and talks about them, and how in verse 2 of Matthew 23, he says, they sit on Moses' seat, so practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice. That's one of the main problems with us as Christians. A lot of times we preach, but we don't practice. We preach and we don't live it out. He goes on and he calls them scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites in verse 13. In verse 13 he talks about, how that they shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. He says, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You travel across sea and land to make a simple proselyte. When he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. In other words, they were making them just like them. They weren't turning out like Jesus. They were trying to get those people to be just like them. And when you read that, you go through and you see all those woes that he had. Look down at verse 25, because that's the one that jumps out at me. Verse 25, he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate. Now, have you ever done that? Clean the outside of the cup and the plate and not cleaned on the inside? You probably haven't done that. When I was single, 34 years ago, when I would wash something, a lot of times I just wash the outside of it and put it up. Wouldn't think anything about it. Then I go in there to get a drink, and I look down there, and there was stuff floating in it, and I thought, something's wrong here. I got married. Kim taught me how to wash dishes. And so now I know to start with the inside and then clean the outside, because that's the way to do it. These scribes and Pharisees, they weren't interested in doing that, were they? They wanted to clean the outside. Just what people saw. That's all they were concerned about. That's all they cared about, was what people saw. And Jesus said they were scribes and they were Pharisees and they were hypocrites. And when he talks to them there, he says, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the outside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. He says, start with what's on the inside. Get your heart right, then your life gets right. It's not get your life right and then your heart gets right. It starts with the heart. And we got to give ourselves to Jesus in baptism and serve him, and then we take care of the outside. We clean the inside first. And that's important for us to pay attention to. The one that really jumps out at me, though, is down in verse 29. When he goes on, he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. And he talks about those. And he says, what you got to do, he says, you say if we lived in the days of our fathers, we would have not taken part with them in shedding blood of the prophets. He said, you would have done the same thing because you're just like them. The verses before that, he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You take that tombs and you paint them on the outside, but on the inside, they're still full of dead men's bones. And what happens a lot of times is, we get to the point where we want to appear righteous, we want to appear religious, but our heart's not right. And so that leads me to my final point tonight, and that is that we need to put into practice what we preach. We need to make it real. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, be ye imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ. In other words, if you follow me, you'll be following Christ. And that's the kind of people we need to be. We need to be people who live for Christ, who give him everything that we have. And when people look at us, they know that we're Christians. In Philippians chapter 4, we'll flip back over to there real quick. Verse 8 and 9, Paul wrote to Timothy and he said, finally, brothers, whatsoever is true, whatsoever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you've learned and received and heard and seen of me, practice these things, and the God of peace shall be with you. He says, whatever we know to do, let's do it. Let's live it. It's not a problem of not knowing the truth. It's a problem of living the truth. If we're going to make a difference in the world, we're going to evangelize the world, we're going to have to start by setting the right kind of example and living the right kind of life. To close, I want to say a statement to you that I've thought about a lot. And this is something that I think is so important for you to hear. There's nothing that you can do to influence others to obey the gospel more than living the Christian life. More than living the Christian life. Because people pay attention and they watch us. And if we want to evangelize the world, we've got to start by setting the right kind of example, living our lives for God. It's easy for us to send money overseas to do mission work. It's easy for us to support orphans' homes and things like that and make us feel good about that. But the thing we need to be doing is evangelizing where we are. And the best way that we can do that by living the Christian life. I challenge you. You go out tonight, tomorrow, the rest of your life, and set the right kind of example, and you'll be evangelizing the world. Thank you for your attention.